frankly, here's the bottom line. Nature has shown us how to grow new real estate. This is a very different paradigm than anybody's talking about building floating structures and putting them on the ocean. We're talking about growing terrain. And then, the structures that we need and want to live on ultimately get integrated into it.
Hello, and welcome to another edition of the Climate Emergency Forum. I'm Herb Simmens. I'm the author of A Climate Vocabulary of the Future. We're really happy to have back with us today for an encore visit, Bruce Kania, who was with us recently talking about the kinds of efforts he's done to enhance the nutrients and the productivity of lakes. And today he's going to shift to a different scale and an equally exciting issue and subject and idea that he has that I think, and I think you will think, is a very exciting one. Bruce is a graduate of the University of Wisconsin. He's focused his professional career on inventions, intellectual property, and he's had a lifelong fascination with the linkages between natural and human systems, combined with his passion for the outdoors, which led him to first conceive the idea of what eventually became the technology behind the BioHaven floating treatment wetlands. Today, he is the president and research director of an organization that's working on all of these projects in Montana. And we're so happy to have you back. We so appreciate that. And what we'll be talking about basically is something called lifestyle islands, building resilience. Now, lifestyle islands sounds like a sitcom, maybe, or something like that, but it's a lot more than that. And so, with that, as always, I'm so happy to have you back, Bruce, and tell us a little bit about what in the world lifestyle islands are and why we should be interested in them.
Well, thank you, Herb, for your very kind introduction. The BioHaven brand of floating islands has been around since 2005. We've got some 12,000 islands launched around the world, primarily in fresh water, but some in brackish and a couple in marine or ocean settings. We've learned a lot since 2005 when we launched the first commercial island. Today, we think that we're probably the best prepared entity to take on seaworthy floating islands. Now, bear in mind, we're talking about floating islands. These are islands that actually can move. They can move north in the summer. They can come south in the winter if we're here in for example, the northern hemisphere. Reverse that in the southern. Imagine being able to target a climactic condition or zone that you want. Imagine the research potential today with ocean iron fertilization happening and it representing one of maybe the most promising potential forms of climate action. The idea of having research platforms that can track and monitor and actually potentially even engage in that process is real. I want to say that my company has been considering this for about 7 or 8 years now. We have recently partnered with a large A&E firm that's architecture and engineering. We've also brought on the largest ship design firm in the world. We are serious about this. And I predict that within 3 years, you're going to see a major public offering to generate seed capital to launch a demonstration lifestyle island of approximately 20 acres. In fact, I'm having the time of my life as an inventor around this topic. I told an investor the other day that I could write a patent today for 30 days and still not be done based on the intellectual property surrounding this concept. There will be hundreds and hundreds of patents relating to it. Frankly, here's the bottom line. Nature has shown us how to grow new real estate. This is a very different paradigm than anybody's talking about building floating structures and putting them on the ocean. We're talking about growing terrain, and then the structures that we need and want to live on ultimately get integrated into it. So with that as sort of the initial backdrop, I'd be very pleased to respond to any questions that you guys might have.
Oh, thanks you. That's very exciting, Bruce, and we will definitely have you back at the next stage of this to tell us how it progresses. Well, I have one question before I turn it over to my colleagues, and then, of course, we're a climate emergency channel. So this, as exciting as this sounds and is unprecedented from what you're saying, tell us the connection between a successful launch, if that's the right word, or implementation of what you're proposing and the climate crisis.
Well, I'll start from the beginning, but every cubic foot of a BioHaven floating island provides some 375 square feet of biofilm reactive surface area. And then when you circulate through that, you've got an incredible biofilm reactor. This is a terrific way to manage nutrients, to cycle nutrients into nature's food web. And when we launch a large biohaven, we're essentially launching a fish aggregation device. The islands have an incredible ability because of their ability to cycle nutrients right within their matrix. They have an incredible ability to trigger nature's food web. But when you're dealing with ocean and that scale of waterway, the reality is that these islands will be the first one I'm committing to personally, will be a research and development platform from which we will support, for example, concepts like ocean iron fertilization, which I believe has merit. I think it's one of the more hopeful means by which we can sequester the kind of scale of carbon dioxide that needs to happen. So, and the idea of having a research platform that you can park in a location and live comfortably on, and a system that will be large enough to contain literally all of the research facilities that are justified for this kind of research. And with some unique technology options that we have relative to, especially around airlift technology, which is a specialty of ours, I think we've got an incredible window of opportunity to help ocean iron fertilization happen appropriately, not dropping fertilizer out of airplanes. That's ridiculous. Or being on site for a week and calling it a study. Yeah, that's the haphazard approach that's going on now. We can do way better than that. And that's
Okay.
part of what our mission will be.
Well, I know personally, I've looked into and know a number of my colleagues who are very excited about ocean iron fertilization, but it is at its in its earliest stages in terms of actually seeing its impacts and how as you said, actually apply it. So it's very interesting and important that you see the synergy between creating these floating islands and the potential of enhancing and implementing ocean iron fertilization. With that, I'm always happy to introduce Dr. Peter Carter. Peter is a retired medical doctor from British Columbia. He is the founder and head of the Climate Emergency Institute, and he has been an expert reviewer for the IPCC. Welcome, Peter. The floor is yours.
Thanks, Herb. It's great to chat with you again, Bruce, on your great initiatives. We have talked about what you're doing, and our group is all very impressed by what you're up to. My first question is anybody else doing this?
Peter, I visited with a gentleman the other day who's deeply involved in the OIF industry, John Ridley. And John noted that just a few years ago, there were only 6 different entities in the field. However, today, John mentions that there's about 50. So the Lifestyle Island Initiative isn't a direct OIF candidate. Instead, we want to support OIF. We want to be there to help it happen appropriately. But relative to floating islands, I know of another manufacturer in Scotland. I think they're called Biomatrix. We have some other forms of floating and treatment wetlands that occur even here in the U.S. There's about 5 or 6 that I know of. I do believe that Floating Island International and the BioHaven brand are the largest today. So, in answer to your question.
So that's pretty darn important. Can you tell us a little bit about your motivation for getting into this and doing this? And I'm thinking about the greenhouse gases, of course, that you know very well, but also socially and personally. What was your motivation?
Peter, I believe that lifestyle islands exemplify human resilience. And frankly, I'm a little embarrassed by the US and our lack of leadership around climate action. So maybe the US's role will be around climate resilience. I heard that our EPA chief actually stated, we're not going to fight climate change. We're about human resilience. Well, maybe this will be a fit for him. But ultimately, for me, what drives me, first of all, I love collaboration with nature. The idea of studying naturally occurring peat-based floating islands like we have. I remember one on Chippewa flowage, 80 acres large, supports tens of thousands of trees, and there's no rigid buoyancy factor that keeps those islands afloat. In fact, the roots were negative buoyant. The roots extended down into these floating islands. What's keeping those islands afloat is the biogas that is trapped within them, contained within them by a lid of peat. And we know how to biomimic that. Plus, we've got redundancy. We use some human stuff, human contrivances for buoyancy as well. So, like I said, Peter, well, we're an invention company, but I like to refer to us as a think tank. And I am surrounded by people with incredible learning and knowledge and wisdom. I've been very fortunate to have succeeded with some early stage inventions that cash flowed nicely, and that's been driving me and my energy since then. So this idea of learning how to grow new real estate, it really has captured my imagination. And I think that life on the ocean, where 71% of the planet, happens to be, marine, ocean space. Well, it's a lot more reasonable to target life on our oceans than it is on Mars. An 80-acre biohaven on the ocean will support 600 to 800 people. So in terms of scalability, in terms of giving humans, buying some time for us to get our stewardship challenges in place in the terrestrial settings, I think that's part of our vision for lifestyle islands.
Okay, can I ask you my favorite topic? What do you expect would be the implications for the greenhouse gases? And I'm asking CO2, methane, but also nitrous oxide, because they all three are implicated in really what you're working in.
We've learned through our work with RAM on freshwater, reduction of aquatic methane. That's an initiative that we're driving. But we've learned that we can design for biofilm breakdown of everything from hydrogen sulfide to methane and probably nitrous oxide. I can't say unequivocally that we can biodigest nitrous oxide yet, but I think that's coming. I will say that We are based in Montana, and we collaborate with the Center for Biofilm Engineering at Montana State University. We also collaborate with Dr. Lisa Stein at the University of Alberta, Edmonton, and she's on the board of NAS's board of atmospheric experts. But Lisa has been an incredible resource for us in helping us understand and quantify, our efficacy, things like this. So we have a heck of a team. And on the other hand, when it comes to OIF, ocean iron fertilization, the potential to safeguard against, for example, inadvertent nitrous oxide emissions, boy, that's a critical area. And being on site and monitoring and tracking of that will be fundamental, or we'll get ourselves into a bigger mess.
Okay, thank you so much, Bruce. You really are most inspiring, and we really enjoy chatting with you and listening to your project. I want to make just one comment on this. We did a previous interview with you. On this interview, you mentioned collaboration with nature, that what you're doing is collaboration with nature. In the last interview, you mentioned partnership with nature, that that's what you're doing. I'd like to sort of stress to the viewers that this is huge, absolutely huge. This is revolutionary in the right and best kind of way. It's the tradition of the indigenous people, and we've got to copy it. Our civilization does just the opposite. Our civilization does not work with nature, does not collaborate with nature. It doesn't even view nature as something alive. Our civilization is based on conquering nature, exploiting nature, damaging and hurting nature. So it's a new paradigm in a way, which is what you're talking about.
Absolutely.
Okay. Thank you, Peter. Thank you, Bruce. I'm happy to introduce Paul Beckwith. Paul, as you know, is a climate system scientist at the University of Ottawa and has a very popular YouTube channel with well over 1,000 videos covering all the dimensions and more of the climate crisis. As always, good to see you, Paul, and the floor is yours.
Yeah, thank you, Bruce, and thanks, Peter, for those questions. I suspect that in terms of greenhouse gases, there's some that are gonna be created in generating this island and having people on it, et cetera. But I think, if you do get the ocean iron fertilization and some other techniques, for example, hanging long lines down from your floating islands into the ocean, and crustaceans can cling to these things, and you could have platforms at various levels under the water. And if you can stimulate or help rejuvenate marine life, which we've killed 90% of the large creatures in the ocean, we can have a huge carbon capture far beyond any greenhouse gas emissions in constructing and operating your platform, the marine life alone being stimulated, artificial reefs, for example, beneath your structures. This would greatly offset any emissions in building them. That's the first point. The second point is, are you planning on having these floating islands within plus or minus 10 degrees latitude of the equator, the tropics? Because in those regions you won't have hurricanes, you won't have to worry about storms ripping apart your platforms, which you would at perhaps higher latitudes. I mean, I couldn't see putting one of these in the Gulf of Mexico, for example, in hurricane season. I mean, they'd just be, they're mobile. I don't know. You haven't talked about propulsion of these. Talked about moving them to different climate zones depending on what people wanted, but presumably their movement would be very slow. I assume you'd have some sort of renewable energy powered electric motors or something. So I guess how far along are you in the planning stages? I mean, you mentioned maybe 3 years you might be able to start getting some seed money. So what stage are you at sort of in the process of generating these islands?
You've given me about 4 or 5 questions in there, and I'm sure I won't cover them all, but we can come back as needed. Let me talk a little bit first about resilience of the island. We've been through at least 3 hurricanes now and 1 typhoon with our BioHaven brand of floating islands. We're in the Gulf of Mexico with wave mitigation systems right now. I think the most extreme hurricane was level 3, but we've survived. We've also been, exposed to massive windstorms in inland waterways. One that lasted for 2 days, 80-mile-an-hour winds for a sustained, short, choppy experience, and we sustained nicely there too. We're extremely resilient. And again, we've got nature's model to start with. The islands that we're biomimicking, in fact, the one that we study the most originated, was born in about 1918 when the Chippewa Reservoir was filled. And today it's 30 feet thick at its center and it's shaped like a deep dish pie, 3 or 4 feet deep, thick along the outside perimeter. But the reality is that our systems would likely be optimally located, at least initially, in the eddies that occur in the ocean, places where upwelling occurs, where nutrients are mixed. And we believe that those are the most critical locations relative to R&D and learning, studying, and optimizing for that OIF phenomenon. The point is that the iron deficiency is primarily, which can trigger effective OIF, is primarily occurring in subarctic waterway zones in both the Pacific and the Atlantic. So that would be a starting point. But I will note that the company that does the ship design work has an incredible trove of background data, research around the oceans that we would employ to answer that question about where to locate. And then you also asked about how to move these islands, how to propel them. We think that this may very well be an application for micronuclear, but wind and wind and solar would also play a role. The bottom line is that today nuclear is used to move aircraft carriers, submarines as well, and it may very well have an application around lifestyle islands on the ocean too. What questions did I forget?
I don't remember all my questions, so I think you probably did well. What sort of lifetime are you talking about for these sort of things? Like, I don't know, you haven't really mentioned the materials you're looking at to
That's
construct
an
them.
excellent point. Thank you. Um, when we launch a BioHaven, within days, there will be a layer of biofilm around every thread of matrix in the island that is saturated. So biofilm is microbes and their residue. So this layer of biofilm is sticky and TSS bonds to it. And that combined material is termed periphyton. So when we grow an island, it's because of that phenomenon. We're growing this periphyton in the saturated zone and we're developing humus on top. And that blend is why an island will expand in one measured study over the space of 11 weeks, island's dry weight biomass increased by 72%. So when I say we're learning how to grow real estate, that's what I'm talking about. Getting back on track. Did I answer your question by saying that I've lost track?
Yeah, I think I mean I also mentioned asked whether you're considering, lowering cables or something and having underwater platforms to try to restore marine life.
That we describe that as biocoral, and that is a product that we produce. But the more three-dimensional configuration we can integrate underneath an island, the more that fish aggregation phenomenon happens. We've launched in the ocean before. The islands will literally be colonized by shellfish
Mhm.
very quickly. They love that setting. And the other point you'd asked about is what are islands made of? They're made of PET, which is polyester. It's drinking water bottles that have been recycled and developed into a matrix, a filter-like material. Then we essentially, by the way, you can hold a handful of matrix in one hand and a handful of the root systems that occur in naturally occurring peat-based floating islands in the other hand, and it's extremely hard to differentiate between the two. But how long will an island last? When you have that coating of biofilm and you have all of this going on, ultimately, we've launched islands in 2005 that are still in operation today. And it appears like they are larger and just as buoyant. And in fact, matrix isn't even visible because it's been covered up by humus on top. So it's like the original BioHaven is a seed. You know, it's the acorn that grows an oak tree. These islands should last indefinitely. And when appropriately stewarded, they will.
Are those freshwater islands that are 21 years old, or do you have any in the ocean?
The oldest that we have in the ocean is roughly 12 years old now.
Okay.
That's in a place called Elfin Cove in southeast Alaska. But the freshwater islands are where we launched initially, and they're the oldest of the BioHaven brand. Yeah, islands will develop trees and plants. And the macrophytes volunteer. So beyond everything we plant, we end up whatever's happening around the perimeter of the waterway ultimately ends up on the island. So that's part of stewardship. Sometimes that's appropriate, other times not.
I mean, do you see any future maybe for creating some of these islands and then, say, Bermuda, they have a huge population density, small island. If they want to park a few of these things on one coastline, they could extend and then connect to the grid on the island. Do you see any future maybe where these floating islands actually become attached permanently to coastlines of some countries that are lacking area for their population growth?
Well, I know there's some islands that are, certainly at risk if
Yeah.
ocean levels change.
Yeah, right. Sea level rise. Yeah. Maldives, for example. Yeah, maybe Maldives would use these to stay located in the Maldives, right? As sea level rises and takes out their island, they could have these things attached to where their island is and continue their way of life there. So you might, look to some of these island states for possible, collaboration or funding even.
Yeah, and I'm kind of anticipating that there'll be somewhat of a governmental market for islands in certain instances where, they'll have geopolitical reasons for wanting islands in certain locations. I think there are applications like that that will evolve.
And then what about maritime laws, international law of the sea? Do you see any of those regulation bodies becoming a problem for what you're doing, being against it or something?
Paul, I recently presented to the International Society of Barristers and came away from that presentation with an attorney who has background around maritime law and environmental law. And she has actually signed up and said, look, I'd like to help. So that's where we're at.
Yeah,
We don't have it, all understood yet. And she
yeah.
admittedly doesn't have it all understood yet either. So, but that's to be determined.
Okay, thank you, Paul. And thank you, Bruce. And interesting, you mentioned the Maldives. And I was just checking my book, which was written 2 years ago. And in my book, it says, I can't remember everything that's in there. It says, under a term that I didn't create, called hydropolis, or basically cities in the water. And it says that there is a full-scale floating city being planned for the Maldives. So I don't know what the status of that is today. Well, I want to thank you and just ask you one last question, Bruce, if I might, before we wrap up. If we were sitting here 20 years from now and you're looking back and I said, did this work? And you said, you know what? It worked better than my wildest dreams. Describe what the world would look like and how it might be different with your floating islands.
I love that question, Herb, and I think I could go on for about 2 hours, unfortunately. But let me just say now that we're incredibly grateful and excited about the place that we are in terms of our development. And I'm looking forward to literally a new paradigm in terms of life on Earth.
All right. Well, that's a pretty dramatic and quite brief summary. As always, it's so nice to have you back, Bruce, for our second discussion. And I want to thank, as always, Peter and Paul for your incisive questions. And basically ask those of you who are watching this to like the channel. That's very important to us. To subscribe to the channel, to go to our website, theclimateemergencyforum.org. And if you're so inclined, and we hope you will be, to press that donate button so that we can continue to provide you with the kind of quality programming that is pretty unique, we think, here in this world on the climate emergency. And with that, again, I just want to thank everybody today, and we will look to see you for another program next week. Thanks again.